Virtue Ethics, MPCR 5000, written and presented by Professor Scott D. Applegate, Georgetown University. In our previous lectures, we covered the consequentialist and non-consequentialist ethical frameworks. In summary, consequentialism judges the morality of an action solely based on the consequences of that action. An action is ethical if it produces the best outcome for the most people. There are no evil actions under a consequentialist framework, only evil outcomes. Deontology or non-consequentialism judges the morality of an action based on some characteristic of the action in and of itself. The result does not matter. An action is considered moral if it aligns with the three formulations of the categorical imperative. Deontology and consequentialism are diametrically opposed to each other. If you are trying to make an argument using both consequentialist and non-consequentialist ethical frameworks, there is a strong chance that one of your arguments is going to be fundamentally flawed. This week, we will focus on our third ethical framework, virtue ethics. We become just by performing just actions, temperate by performing temperate actions, brave by performing brave actions. Aristotle. What are virtue ethics? Virtue ethics are one of the three major families of modern ethical theories, the others being deontology or non-consequentialism and consequentialism or utilitarianism. Virtue ethics emphasizes virtues or moral character, in contrast to the approach that emphasizes duty or rules, deontology, or the one that emphasizes consequences of actions, consequentialism. Whereas a consequentialist will define virtues as traits that yield good consequences, and deontologists will define virtues as traits possessed by those who reliably fulfill their duties, virtue ethicists will resist the attempt to define virtue in terms of some other concept that is taken to be more fundamental. Rather, virtues and vices will be foundational for virtue ethics theories, and other normative notions will be grounded in them. In other words, virtue ethicists view virtues as an end rather than a means. Origins of virtue ethics. Plato and Aristotle are considered the founding fathers of virtue ethics in the West. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher during the classical period of ancient Greece. Taught by Plato, he was the founder of the Lyceum, the Peripatetic school of philosophy, and the Aristotelian tradition. His writings cover many subjects including physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, theater, music, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, politics, and government. Aristotle provided a complex synthesis of various philosophies existing prior to him. Aristotle's philosophy has exerted a unique influence on almost every form of knowledge in the West, and it continues to be the subject of contemporary philosophical discussion to this day. Plato was an Athenian philosopher during the classical period of ancient Greece, founder of the Platonist school of thought and the Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. Plato has often been cited as one of the founders of modern Western religion and spirituality. Plato was the innovator of the written dialogue and dialectic forms of philosophy. Plato is also considered the founder of Western political philosophy. Plato was also mentored and taught by Socrates. Both Aristotle and Plato believed that regularly conducting right actions would ingrain in us a habit of being a right or moral person. Socrates was a classical Athenian philosopher credited as one of the founders of Western philosophy and as being the first moral philosopher in the Western ethical tradition of thought. An enigmatic figure, he made no writings and is known chiefly through the accounts of classical writers writing after his lifetime, particularly his students Plato and Xenophon. Perhaps his most important contribution to Western thought is his dialectic method of inquiry, also known as the Socratic method, which he largely applied to the examination of key moral concepts such as good and justice. To solve a problem, it would be broken down into a series of questions, the answers to which gradually distill the answer the person would seek. The development and practice of this method is one of Socrates' most enduring contributions and is a key factor earning him his mantle as father of political philosophy, ethics, and moral philosophy, and is a figurehead in all central themes in Western philosophy. The Socratic method is also considered as a defining element of the American legal system. The term Socratic paradox can also refer to a self-referential paradox, originating in Socrates' utterance, "What I do not know, I do not think I know," often paraphrased as, "I know that I know nothing at all." The moral virtues, then, are produced in us neither by nature nor against nature. Nature, indeed, prepares in us the ground for their reception, but their complete formation is a product of habit. Aristotle. Origins of virtue ethics. In the Eastern philosophies, virtue ethics can separately be traced back to the teachings of Mencius and Confucius. Confucius was a Chinese philosopher and politician who lived between 551 and 479 BCE. The philosophy of Confucius, also known as Confucianism, emphasized personal and governmental morality, correctness of social relationships, justice, kindness, and sincerity. Confucius emphasized self-cultivation, emulation of moral exemplars, and the attainment of skilled judgment or wisdom rather than knowledge of rules. Confucius is traditionally credited with having authored or edited many of the classic Chinese texts, including all of the 5 classics. Confucius' principles have commonality with Chinese tradition and belief. He championed strong family loyalty, ancestor veneration, and respect of elders by their children and of husbands by their wives, recommending family as a basis for ideal government. Confucius is widely considered as one of the most important and influential individuals in human history. His teachings and philosophy have greatly impacted people around the world and remain influential today. What you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. Confucius. Origins of virtue ethics. In the West, virtue ethics was the prevailing approach to ethical thinking in the ancient and medieval periods. Virtue ethics regained prominence in Western philosophical thought in the 20th century. In the East, Confucianism was practiced as a religion, although it is more akin to a secular ethical philosophy. Confucianism has strongly shaped East Asian societies, Chinese communities, and other parts of Asia. Central concepts of virtue ethics. Although modern virtue ethics does not have to take a neo-Aristotelian or eudaemonist form, in other words, not necessarily founded in classical Greek philosophy, almost any modern version still shows that its roots are in ancient Greek philosophy by the employment of the 3 central concepts derived from it. These are arete, excellence or virtue, phronesis, practical or moral wisdom, and eudaimonia, usually translated as happiness or human flourishing. We will discuss each of these concepts in the upcoming slides. Arete, or virtue. A virtue is an excellent trait of character, one that goes all the way down to the core. A good example would be honesty. What does it mean to be an honest person? Why do you behave honestly? An honest person cannot be identified simply as one who, for example, practices honest dealings and does not cheat. If such actions are done merely because the agent thinks honesty is the best policy, or because they fear being caught, rather than through recognizing to do otherwise would be dishonest, as the relevant reason. An honest person's reasons and choices with respect to honest and dishonest actions reflect their views about honesty, truth, and deception. But of course, such views manifest themselves with respect to other actions and to emotional reactions as well. A virtue ethicist who serves honesty does so to the very core of their being. Valuing honesty as they do, they choose where possible to work with honest people, to have honest friends, to bring up their children to be honest. They disapprove of, dislike, deplore dishonesty, and are not amused by certain tales of chicanery. They despise or pity those who succeed through deception rather than thinking they have been clever. They are unsurprised or pleased as appropriate when honesty triumphs, and are shocked or distressed when those near and dear to them do what is dishonest. This description illustrates how seriously virtue ethicists take and embrace virtues. Arete, or virtue. Virtue ethicists draw a distinction between full or perfect virtue and continence or strength of will. Those who have full or perfect virtue act simply because it aligns with their virtue and is therefore right. They do not struggle against other impulses in order to act. But struggling against other impulses and having the strength of will to act correctly is called continence. In some cases, this can be thought of as falling short of perfect virtue, but motive and context do matter. Describing the continent as falling short of perfect virtue appears to go against the intuition that there is something particularly admirable about people who manage to act when it is especially hard for them to do so. But the plausibility of this depends on exactly what makes it hard. If it is circumstances in which the agent acts, say that she is very poor and hungry when someone drops a full purse, then indeed it is particularly admirable of her to restore the purse when it is hard for her to do so. But what if what makes it hard is an imperfection in her character, a temptation to keep what is not hers because she is a dishonest person at heart? Then it is not admirable. Phronesis or practical wisdom. Phronesis is defined as moral or practical wisdom. It is not enough to just have virtue. You must also have the moral or practical wisdom, gained through experience and deep contemplation, to find the right answer to a dilemma in a particular context. The ordinary usage or the reliance on motivation by inclination gives us what Aristotle calls natural virtue or proto-virtue of full virtue, awaiting perfection by phronesis or practical wisdom. Without phronesis, common virtues can become faults. For example, the saying, generous or honest to a fault, illustrates the potential for a virtue to become a vice without the understanding provided by phronesis. Imagine someone who is so generous that they give away so much of their income they can no longer pay their bills. Or someone who is so honest they always speak the truth, even when it is unnecessarily hurtful to do so. Phronesis or practical wisdom. The concept of phronesis can best be understood by thinking of what a virtuous, morally mature adult has that nice children, including nice adolescents, lack. Practical wisdom. Those of us who have children often find them trying to do the right thing, but causing harm in the process because they lack the experience or wisdom to fully understand the repercussions of their actions. I can recall as a child trying to help my mother clean the dishes after dinner. I loaded up the dishwasher with dirty dishes, poured in some Dawn dish detergent soap into the soap holder, and ran the dishwasher. An hour later, my mother was dealing with a kitchen full of soap studs. My lack of experience and understanding created a much worse situation, even though my intentions were pure and ethical. Eudaimonia. The final concept in classical virtue ethics is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is roughly translated as happiness or human flourishing, but it is broader than just happiness. It is real or true happiness that is worth seeking or having. Eudaimonist forms of virtue ethics define virtues in terms of their relationship to eudaimonia. The idea behind eudaimonist forms of virtue ethics, in layman's terms, is that we should cultivate virtue and practical wisdom that contributes to or is a constituent of human flourishing or true happiness. Forms of virtue ethics. While all forms of virtue ethicists agree that virtue is the central premise and that practical wisdom is required, they differ in how they combine these and other concepts to illuminate what we should do in particular contexts and how we should live our lives as a whole. There are four major forms of virtue ethics: eudaimonist virtue ethics, agent-based or exemplarist virtue ethics, target-centered virtue ethics, and Platonistic virtue ethics. We will briefly discuss each of these in the coming slides. Forms of virtue ethics. Eudaimonist virtue ethics. The distinctive feature of eudaimonist versions of virtue ethics is that they define virtues in terms of their relationship to eudaimonia. A virtue is a trait that contributes to or is a constituent of eudaimonia, and we ought to develop virtues precisely because they contribute to eudaimonia. As we have noted, eudaimonia is a morally laden form of happiness. The cultivation of physical pleasure or the acquisition of wealth might make us happy, but would not be an example of eudaimonia, as they don't generally contribute to human flourishing. Virtue ethicists claim that a human life devoted to physical pleasure or the acquisition of wealth is not eudaimon, but a wasted life. Agent-based virtue ethics. Rather than driving the normativity of virtue from the value of eudaimonia, agent-based virtue ethicists argue that other forms of normativity, including the value of eudaimonia, are traced back to and ultimately explained in terms of the motivational and dispositional qualities of the agents. Agent-based virtue ethicists might define rightness or wrongness in terms of an agent's motivation. In other words, they understand the rightness in terms of good motives and wrongness in terms of having bad or insufficiently good motives. Forms of virtue ethics. Target-centered virtue ethics. In target-centered virtue ethics, a virtuous act is an act that hits the target of a virtue, which is to say that it succeeds in responding to items in its field in a specified way. A complete account of virtue will map out 1. Its field, 2. Its mode of responsiveness, 3. Its basis of moral acknowledgement, and 4. Its target. Different virtues are concerned with different fields. Courage, for example, is concerned with what might harm us, whereas generosity is concerned with the sharing of time, talent, property, and so on. So let's map out a virtue by the 4 aspects I just mentioned. We'll look at generosity. Generosity's field is to be attentive to the benefit that others might enjoy through one's agency. Generosity's mode promotes a good for generosity's basis, namely another's benefit. And generosity's target is an aim to share time, talent, or possession with others in a way that benefits them. A virtue on a target-centered account is a disposition to respond to or acknowledge items within its field or fields in an excellent or good enough way. A virtuous act is an act that hits the target of the virtue, which is to say that it succeeds in responding to items in its field in a specified way. Platonistic virtue ethics. Platonistic virtue can be thought of as the most inward-facing and most contemplative form of virtue ethics. The defining feature of Platonistic virtue ethics is to be that good agency is the truest and fullest sense presupposes the contemplation of the form of the good. In the moral life, the enemy is the fat, relentless ego. Constantly attending to our needs, our desires, our passions, and our thoughts skews our perspective on what the world is actually like and blinds us to the good around us. Contemplating the goodness of something we encounter, which is to say, carefully attending to it for its own sake, in order to understand it, breaks this natural tendency by drawing our attention away from ourselves. Contemplating such goodness with regularity makes room for new habits of thought that focus more readily and more honestly on things other than the self. At the end of the day, there are many different forms of virtue ethics. These 4 are illustrated just to show you some of the subtle differences between the different philosophies. Virtue is the central tenet of all virtue ethics, and all state that phronesis or practical wisdom is required. Beyond that, the subtle differences in how each of these forms of virtue ethics combines arete, phronesis, and other concepts is beyond the scope of this course, and is only illustrated to show you that within each major theory, there are many, many variations. Objections to virtue ethics. Similar to other ethical theories that we have studied, there are those who have raised objections to virtue ethics. We will cover these 8 objections over the next few slides. Objections to virtue ethics. Application. Critics argue virtue ethics does not give us a codified set of rules that a non-virtuous person could understand and apply to act virtuously. There is no procedure for determining what the right action is in any particular case. Virtue ethicists maintain that it is quite unrealistic to imagine that there could be such a code. Objections to virtue ethics. Adequacy. Critics argue that virtue ethics cannot provide an adequate account of right action. It is possible to perform right action without being virtuous, and to perform wrong actions without calling into account the agent's virtue. Both the virtuous and those who lack virtue can create the same actions. Virtue ethicists reject the assumption that virtue ethics ought to be in the business of providing an account of right action, but instead focus on what kind of person one should become and what kind of life one should live. Objections to virtue ethics, relativism, and conflict. Critics argue that different cultures value different virtues such that some virtuous choices will be right or wrong only in relation to a particular culture. Additionally, detractors of virtue ethics also point out that there is no method in virtue ethics to resolve a conflict or dilemma between different virtues that are applicable to the same moral decision. Virtue ethicists would note that these objections also apply to deontological ethics, so they are not unique criticisms to virtue ethics. That being said, virtue ethicists would also argue that phronesis, or practical wisdom, can assist in resolving dilemmas of conflict. Objections to virtue ethics, self-effacement and justification. An ethical theory is self-effacing if roughly whatever it claims justifies a particular action or makes it right is the moral agent's motive for doing it. In other words, we shouldn't cultivate honesty because virtue ethics tells us honesty is a good virtue. We should cultivate honesty because we are indeed an honest person. All three families of ethics suffer from self-effacement. The moral agent who rightly visits a friend in a hospital will rather lessen the impact of that visit if he tells her he is doing it because it is his duty, or because he thought it would maximize the general happiness. But she won't be any better pleased if he tells her that he is visiting her because it is what a virtuous moral agent would do. So virtue ethics would appear to have the self-effacement problem as deontology and consequentialism. It is important to do the right thing because it is the right thing to do, not because some ethical theory tells us it's the right thing to do. Justification. How do we justify or ground our ethical beliefs? In its particular versions, for deontology there is the question of how to justify its claims that certain moral rules are the correct ones, and for utilitarianism, of how to justify its claim that all that really matters morally are consequences for happiness or well-being. For virtue ethics, the problem concerns the question of which character traits are actually virtues. Objections to virtue ethics, egoism and situational problems. Critics argue that virtue ethics are self-rewarding or self-regarding and are therefore selfish. If the focus of my ethical framework is to cultivate moral values within myself, then I am the main beneficiary. Virtue ethicists argue that self-regarding virtues do benefit others, and that without them human flourishing or eudaimonia is not possible. So, for example, if I cultivate generosity, the target of that is some other person. If I cultivate honesty, that benefits others I have dealings with. Situational problems. Situationalist social psychology claims that there are no such thing as character traits and thereby no such thing as virtues. But as is often the case in things involving the human mind, the science is still out on this issue, and there are contradictory scientific works out there that dispute these findings. Virtue ethics in cyberspace. Virtue ethicists would argue that virtue ethics apply to cyberspace, as we do not leave our morals at the door when we sit down to work on a computer. A virtuous person will behave in a virtuous manner regardless of whether they are in the physical or virtual world. How many of us know a relatively nice person who becomes a vicious troll when they are shielded by the anonymity of the internet? Which face is a true reflection of their moral character? Virtue ethicists would argue that the trolling behavior is their true self. Unshackled from the threats of identification and retaliation, they display their real ethics for all to see. Shannon Bowler identifies 12 techno-moral virtues which she believes can serve individuals as a guide for making ethical and moral decisions about their conduct in cyberspace. She lists honesty, self-control, humility, justice, courage, empathy, care, civility, flexibility, perspective, magnanimity, and wisdom. She suggests that individuals in technological fields can practice these virtues in their daily lives. One of the inherent differences between real space and the internet and its architecture is that the internet facilitates vices like deception. There is often a great deal of disparity between how people act in the real world and how they act in cyberspace. We've all come across trolls and internet bullies, and some of us have met those same people in real life. The question becomes, which is the real reflection of that person? What actions reflect their true inner nature, their true vices and virtues? This is not a unique issue for virtue ethics, but since virtue ethics fundamentally looks at what kind of person we should be, it would seem to have more impact in terms of how an individual might act online versus in person. A virtuous person will not change their behavior simply because they are shielded by the anonymity of the internet. Summary. Virtue ethics emphasizes virtues or moral character. The right actions are those that enrich the character and lead to human flourishing. Virtue ethics originated from the teachings of Plato and Aristotle in the West and Mencius and Confucius in the East. All forms of virtue ethics focus on arete, excellence or virtue, and phronesis, practical wisdoms. Some forms involve eudaimonia or human flourishing or other concepts. Excellence is not a gift, but a skill that takes practice. We do not act rightly because we are excellent. In fact, we achieve excellence by acting rightly. Plato. Be a free thinker and don't accept everything you hear as truth. Be critical and evaluate what you believe in. Aristotle. If you have questions about this presentation or other aspects of the course, please feel free to email me or post a question in the Ask Your Instructor discussion forum in Canvas. I tend to respond to email much faster than to forum posts, but if you believe your question may be of interest to other students, then the Ask Your Instructor forum may be the more appropriate venue for your question. This has been Virtue Ethics, MPCR 5000, written and presented by Professor Scott D. Applegate, Georgetown University.